We're now here in section number 3, so congratulations to making it to what I would consider probably about the halfway point of this course. And section 3 is all about modular synthesis, and there are so many great alliterations we can do with modular. Modular madness, modular mayhem, the modular state of mind, whatever. They just roll off the tongue. And some of you might be a little bit concerned and be wondering, why are you showing us modular in week number 3? Shouldn't this be something you show us at the end after we go through more of the basic subtractive synthesizers and work our way up? And I would actually argue that with this course, we shouldn't be looking at it in terms of beginner to advanced. That's not the idea. These are all just the methods, and they should all be relatively the same in terms of difficulty. It's just a matter of wrapping your head around what is going on with the method. That's what's important for this course. It's not so much what will you practically be able to do at the end of this. That's something that's up to you to practice on, but it really is just understanding the logic and, in this case, especially moving forward, why things developed the way they developed. And so this will work very nicely for us here in section 3 because we can sort of follow the historical arc, beginning with the modular synthesizer and eventually working our way up to some of the things like, these wavetable synthesizers and things that we have inside of the digital audio workstation today. So we're going to go through a little bit of history here because it's going to be useful. What you're looking at is the Mark II synthesizer. It is now housed in Columbia University. It's actually in someone's office, so you can see the person's office chair. This synthesizer, I don't know if it's even still functional. It uses all vacuum tubes, and I assume the tubes that it uses, they probably don't even manufacture them anymore. And this is not really a modular synthesizer the way we think about it. This is truly a programmable synthesizer in that you have to use like those old punch-out coding sheets of paper. You kind of code it and then you have to like run it through a really rudimentary computer and it's able to generate sound that way. But this project began, and at least this is a myth, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but from what I understand, this project began and was funded by RCA and by a lot of other people because the people who were pitching it were arguing that a synthesizer could eventually replace an orchestra or could replace studio musicians. So if you think about it, it maybe is worth all of that R&D expense if it means saving money on records and the listeners aren't going to be able to tell a difference. I mean, for better or worse, most of the developments that we see with music technology are all based on purely economics and who stands to gain the most. And so if you think about it, it's worth pumping in tons of money if it means not needing to hire all of these individual musicians. Kind of sad in that, you're going to lose that aspect to it. And obviously that's not what happened. This thing is not at all capable of generating realistic sounds. People, at least in those days and even today, a lot of times, I would rather go to or I should say, I'd rather go and buy a vinyl of a really great orchestra performing something as compared to, hearing a synthesizer do it, because I could set that up myself at home, using a MIDI file. So it didn't replace the orchestra, but what it did do is it set off this, just really vast history and evolution of synthesis, which is what we will be covering. So was this instrument ultimately worth the R&D expense? You could argue it was because of what came after it. People were inspired by this instrument and then went on to develop their own things. And eventually some of those instruments did go into the studio. And for the most part, at least in like the 80s and 90s, you didn't often have studio musicians coming in. You just used different synthesizers and a music producer or one person who's somewhat capable on the keyboard. That was the person who was generating all the sounds. And of course, there's some pushback against that, and people still like getting records with actual instruments being played on them. But for the most part now, synthesizer sounds are like a part of our DNA and a part of popular music. So all of this is possible thanks in large part to advancements in electronics and really just the advent of electricity. So as I put here in the second bullet, we're talking about power. All right, power and the ability to control that power, oftentimes in the form of voltage. So you think of voltage-controlled filters, voltage-controlled amplifiers. That's literally what is going on beneath the hood, right? There are components and things that are inside that instrument designed to control the voltage to then shape the sound in one way or another, to generate the oscillator tone, to then have a filter that's capable of cutting some of that off. It's all manipulation of electricity. It's all manipulation of voltage. Of course, in the computer, that's not exactly what's going on, right? We just have these algorithms, it's all code. But for your computer to be powered, that does require electricity. It requires voltage to keep the battery running and to keep all of your processors going. So it's kind of funny. You do come full circle in that you don't really think of the computer as being like, a VCA or a VCF or a subtractive synthesizer, but that's what makes all of this possible. And that's what's made so many of the advancements possible with music technology. So if you want more information on the actual history of modular synthesizers and just synthesis in general, we'll be doing a lot more of this in this presentation. But if you want a really in-depth look with a lot of good visuals, I would recommend you check out the documentary I Dream of Wires. And it does a great job of kind of going through why all of this happened. And it will do a much better job than I'm going to do. So if you just go to idreamofwires.org, it goes into that. And then in the second half of the documentary, it's all about modular synthesis and kind of the revival and rebirth of it. Okay, so we're just going to kind of jump here and say we had that Mark II synthesizer. That was really what started the whole trend. And now modular is born. And modular is a very simple concept. All right, you have different modules, individual modules that all do different things. So you have an oscillator module, which you screw into something. You have a filter module, which you screw into something. But if you don't like that filter, you could take it out and replace it with something different. You have envelope generators, you have LFOs, and all of these things can then be literally patched together using cables to then generate your sound. And this is why we're kind of starting with modular, because synthesis in general is really a matter of just understanding signal flow. How is that sound being generated? What is it going through? In what order is it going through? And that's what we'll be spending most of this week really talking about. So we have two competing schools of synth manufacturing or of synthesizer creation. We have the East Coast style, which is realism. We're back to that word again. So again, trying to possibly replace the real instruments and the real musicians. And then you have the West Coast style, which was something completely new. We're trying to generate an instrument that's just capable of creating sounds that don't have any equivalent to the real world. They don't even necessarily have to be pitched in a traditional way. Really just trying to make new music. And so those are your two competing schools. And we'll begin here with the East Coast. And this looks familiar to you. It probably should. Not only like the paint scheme, but just those knobs. This is sort of the Moog version. This is what ultimately wins out. And that's why something like this looks so familiar to us. So we have an example here of a Moog modular synthesizer. And the thing to pay attention to are really just all of those little ports that are open. And that's for you to put your patch cables into to ultimately then generate the sound. Often with the Moog modular and with the East Coast style of modular synthesizers, we associate it with a traditional keyboard controller, something that's pitched, something that's going to stay or hopefully stay in tune that you can play up and down the keyboard. And this is why it's all about realism. Right? We want to be able to play something and get the result that we're expecting. The downside, and we'll get to these downsides later on, is you don't, or you can't, I should say, scroll through presets on this, right? I can't get a violin and then suddenly 2 seconds later have a bass sound or something that sounds like a bass. I can't have a synthetic violin followed by a synthetic bass followed by a synthetic trumpet. I'd have to manually go through and repatch the instrument and change all of those settings. But at the end of the day, this synthesizer, this model, the East Coast method, was really aimed at realism, trying to generate sounds that in one way or another, work like traditional instruments would. And now we move over to West Coast, and this is more the Buchla design. And just by looking at this looks nothing like this. Right? Totally different. All sorts of knobs all over the place. I think this one might actually use pins as compared to cables. I'm not 100% sure about that. I think I might actually be wrong on that point. I do think it's just your normal aux jack sizes. But this instrument and the next one we're going to look at here, what you can see is at the bottom, we have a controller that is nothing like your traditional MIDI keyboard. And that's because this instrument isn't designed to be realistic. It's designed to make sounds for its own sake, to do things that you really could never expect to get with a real instrument. And that's kind of the debate between the two of those, the East Coast and the West Coast. And in I Dream of Wires, they talk about sort of the reasons why. If you go to, I don't know what the right word is here, more or less liberal art schools that offer electronic music like I did, you really get drilled with the ideology of what was going on with the West Coast, especially with the modular design, what they were trying to accomplish. But obviously, as we all know, the East Coast mindset won out, and it's the reason why we've seen the development in synthesizers to become easier to work with, portable, and capable of generating those, realistic quote unquote sounds. And I find this kind of funny. We're looking at the mini Moog here, which when you think about it, not that much different to what we see here, with the exception of it's all hardwired in the back. So we're not going to be taking out this oscillator bank and putting something else in there. No, this is what it is, and it's all connected on the back end. I always find this a little bit funny that it says, please do not touch in this picture. That's why I chose it. Synthesizers are all about a tangible experience, but this is sitting in a museum, so I understand, I guess, why that's on there. But just so you could see what ultimately won out and why instrument design, synthesizer design, has gone the direction that it's gone, which is easy to use, easily portable, changing sounds on the fly. All of this started with modular and what people really wanted, because Moog's whole thought process from the beginning was, I'm going to try to sell these to music studios so that they can replace, the studio musician. That was his whole business model that he tried to use. And that's why things like this instrument, the Mini Moog and others, were eventually developed and marketed and sold. And there's a lot of reasons for why the East Coast won out over the West Coast. Some of it really just had to do sheerly with marketing dollars going in, and that wasn't something that Buchla and his team really were interested in doing or wanted to do. So again, you can check the documentary for more on that. Some positives of modular synthesis. In terms of hardware synthesizers, I don't count software synthesizers in this. I would say modular synths, for the most part, are capable of getting you as diverse timbres as you're going to get, because anything is possible. You can plug any cable into any other cable slot and, control the sound in ways that with something that's hardwired, you just can't do. You could probably argue that like the Synthi, the CMI instrument, maybe possible of more diverse timbres, but in a different way. I think with modular, it's actually easier to kind of just quickly experiment with sound and get something on the fly as compared to that whole system. And that whole system is even more expensive than something like this, which in its own right carries a pretty high price tag. Another positive of modular is that it's a very physical, it's a very tangible experience, which people often like. And now in 2016, people get really attached to their modular synthesizers, almost like it's a small child. They'll name them and they take a lot of pride in them. They'll travel with them to conventions and show off their modular synth setup. So there's a pride element to it as well. You don't see me rolling up to some convention with my computer and saying, hey, look at this great preset I created inside of my DAW. That doesn't happen. But with modular, that sort of a thing certainly does. And it's opened up an entire industry of different modules that are created by third-party vendors. I mean, it's a good small business opportunity for a lot of people. So that's always a good thing as well. Modular downsides. There are a lot of downsides to modular synthesizers, and you can see this man has clearly snapped. Cost is a biggie. Very, very expensive, even with the stuff that we can do today where you can kind of create your own and try to keep the budget relatively low. It's still a pretty big cost. Transportation was the biggie, especially with the Moog modular setup, or if people even had custom designed modular synthesizers in their studio. How do you take that and transport it to a gig? if you're like a rock band or something. And we know modular synthesizers are a lot of times associated with progressive rock bands. How do you actually move it and make sure then that everything isn't going way out of tune? That's the biggest problem, I think, with modular, is that you take it, it's rattling around in a truck or something, and you've spent all of this time to tune this instrument. Now it's completely out of whack again. You kind of have to start from scratch. You need to take a million pictures so that you can then patch it up in real time. Well, what happens when you go from one song to the next song? Do you need to have like a 20-minute break so somebody can reprogram the instrument? It's just not feasible or practical. So they're great for the studio, but they're terrible for on the road. And that's why things like the Mini Moog were eventually developed, because you could easily transport those things and very quickly reprogram the instrument to go from song to song to song. Reliability. With modular, especially older modular synthesizers, things break all the time, and attempting to get back there and to fix it, very difficult, time consuming, and again, another expense. You could argue that modular synthesizers aren't that practical. You can't go fast with them. You can't quickly call up presets, and that's why I have recall on there too. And for a lot of people, because if you look at this instrument, this seems like there has to be a really steep learning curve. And if you're not able to kind of break it down and go through modular in baby steps like we're going to do, I think it's very difficult to wrap your head around. Like if you walk into a room with this giant modular synth, you'd have no idea where to begin. And that's also why I bring up this question of repeatable results. Because some of the modules are not that reliable, can you really get the same thing twice? Usually you can't. That's why I left that little dramatic pause in there. Something for you to ponder a little bit. But even so, modular has started to see a really big revival in the last, I'd say, maybe 5 to 6 years. It's suddenly coming back in style, in large part thanks to the Euro rack format. A lot like you have that lunchbox idea for like the little mixing modules, right? Like you can get an API EQ, you can get like a Shadow Hills mastering compressor, and you can fit it into this little lunchbox, and you can almost create, you know, your dream little mixing rig, and then you can send audio through it and whatever. The same idea is true for modular synthesis. And so you start with something like this, the container, and something like this one from Roland, the SRYR-E84. It has its own power supply built in. So it's very easy now to just take the little modules, put them in, screw them in, power it up, and you're ready to go with modular synthesis. And so a lot of people, I think, were fed up with what they were seeing in terms of synthesizer design being so cookie cutter, everything being subtractive, everything pushing into a digital direction, that somebody had the great idea of, well, you know, with how electronics has changed, with how much smaller the parts have become, why don't we just create these tiny little mini modules and we can, you know, bring back modular? And that's exactly what's happened. And if you go to a website like modulargrid.net, you can actually map out your own dream modular synthesizer. And as you can see, and as I mentioned before, there's a lot of third-party vendors who will make these little modules that you can then fit into your Euro rack. You just get your patch cables going, and you're ready to start working with modular synthesis. But we do have to come to this slide, and I think this is really important with modular, because I know a lot of people who got really into it or who are really into it, but they're not music makers. They're just modular hobbyists. So you have to ask yourself this question. I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. I just think it's important to highlight this aspect of it. For most people, modular synthesis is a hobby. It's very difficult to take modular synthesis and make coherent tracks with it. People do it every single day, but those songs often aren't very popular, number one. Number two, very difficult to make, somewhat time consuming. And number three, it comes back to that repeatable results question. So there's a handful of people out there who have taken this idea of modular synthesis and have made a career out of it, but it's still pretty expensive. And it's not always that practical. So people get obsessed with all of these different little modules that they can buy, and they start just becoming a hobbyist and a collector. You see the same problem for people with plugins, right? It's just about collecting as many plugins as possible. They're never really going to use them. And the same issue sometimes happens for people when they're creating their own modular synthesizers, and it's still pretty expensive. Like, I mean, something like this would probably cost you $2,000. And I had somebody tell me once, and I'm going to share it with you because I think it's somewhat relevant here. There was a guy interested in getting like a modular synthesizer, and the person told them, they said, "Oh, well, do you have a comfortable chair like for your music studio?" The person was like, "No." They're like, "Do you enjoy being down in your music studio? Is it a place that is really creatively inspiring for you?" And the person was like, "No, not really. It's just sort of like a room." And the guy was like, "Take that $2,000, invest in a good chair, invest in some things that are going to make that room inspiring for you. Because if you want to be a music maker, it's about sitting in front of, most of the time, the computer making music." A modular synthesizer, while it's nice to have and it's kind of a unique thing and a boutique item, if your goal is to be a music maker, you could probably invest that money in maybe a lot smarter ways. But if you have a lot of expendable income, by all means, get into it. I'm not telling you not to jump into hardware modular synth domain. I just know for me personally, it's not something that I would probably ever do because I'd rather spend that money on things that are going to help me making music. So it's just a question to ask yourself, and I thought it was important to bring up, because I don't get a lot of questions on the website, but one of the questions I do get a lot of times is, I have X amount of dollars to spend. Where should I spend it? And a lot of times for me, it's about comfort items. It's like, yeah, get yourself a nicer chair, get yourself a nice desk, make sure that your speakers are good and inspiring to you. Do you have a nice audio interface? Because when you think about everything that's in the computer, and especially all the things that are there for free, making music is more about that daily grind of doing it than it is about having the newest and greatest tools. So I know this is outside the scope of this course, but it's something to bring up because I know how cool modular looks, but in the flesh sometimes it's not as inspiring as you might think it would be. All right, so now on to what we'll be looking at in this section, since this is all about, computer music and what we can do with software. The first modular system that you encounter, and you encounter it every day, is the digital audio workstation. It acts a lot like a modular synthesizer, just on a much larger level. The DAW is the shell, and then you bring things in and you determine the signal flow. You can move things around, right? You can route audio one place or another. The only difference is you're not seeing the cables and you're not literally having to connect things. So it's a little bit easier. But when you think of your DAW just as one large modular framework, it makes the idea of modular synthesis that much easier, because that's really all the DAW is. It's your Eurorack case, and you're figuring out how you want to fill it and how you want to move things around. That, to me, is how I always think of the digital audio workstation. And so a lot of soft synths, they actually operate on more of a hybrid modular principle. Anything where you can determine and change the routing is completely related to modular synthesis. All right, you can choose, where do I want the wave shaper? Something like Zebra, right? You can put in a distortion module before or after the oscillator, before or after the filter. You can bring in a reverb at different points. Modular is all about possibilities. It's all about flexibility, as compared to your hardwired synths like the Mini Moog, where it's patched in the back and you can't change that, right? It is what it is. But in the computer, with most of our instruments, we a lot of times have a lot of routing possibilities. So Zebra being a great example. If I owned it, I would show it to you. Unfortunately, I don't. But Zebra is just the greatest example of sort of the hybrid modular that we see. And a lot of people don't think about it that way, but that really is what that instrument is all about. With Massive, you can go into the routing page and you can determine the signal flow of some elements to it. Not everything. For the most part, it is following a certain trajectory, right? Oscillator, filter, effects, but you can move some things around. We looked at Kaivo a little bit in physical modeling. As you saw, for me to set up the modulators, I had sort of like those virtual patch cables where I was just sort of moving things around. And then also we have another instrument from Yuhi like Batzilla, I'm not sure how you actually say it, which uses, again, a lot of these virtual cables to patch things up, which gives you a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more sonic possibilities than if you just had something that was hardwired. So as I said, anything that gives you custom routing options owes a lot and pays a lot of homage to modular designs. So coming full circle, most of the soft synths coming out nowadays do give you that kind of flexibility, routing flexibility, etc. All right, so the main ideas for this week, what we're going to be talking about. With modular, we can break the modern synthesizer down to its most basic and standard components and then literally connect those all together so that we'll get a better understanding of signal flow. That's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be starting with almost like a blank slate inside of Reaktor, patching up some of these modules, and really just making the whole process very simple for you. A basic understanding of modular synthesis and how these things work will make learning and understanding the hardwired synths that we'll be looking at in the upcoming weeks very, very simple. Modular is a sonic playground. I want you to treat it that way when you're off on your own, just sort of experimenting. Think sound first and result second. So be willing to plug something, let's say plug an oscillator, the output of an oscillator into the input of, an LFO or whatever, something that normally wouldn't make sense. Be willing to experiment with that because you have the opportunity to do that with modular. Where with the hardwired synths, you're just not going to have that same sort of flexibility and, just sheer imagination. I think modular and imagination are two words that certainly can go hand in hand. It's like experimental, modular, imagination, and that's what we'll be looking at in this week.